Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Impact Talks. Today we have Emily Balcetis with us. She's an associate professor at New York University. She received her PhD from Cornell University in 2006 and is the author of more than 70 scientific publications, as well as the author of Clearer, Closer, Better: How Successful People See the World. I'm really excited to have you on, specifically because we have a lot of startups that turn into scale-ups, start growing, maybe even selling their businesses. And there's a huge divide as to how you're starting your business to once you've sold it, what do you do then? So many questions that pop up. Of course, we'll discuss other things that you've discovered in your research, but I'm just very happy to have you on. Please tell the people what you do and where you're from.
Thank you for that lovely introduction and for the opportunity to have this conversation today with you and with your audience. I'm really excited for it. I'm a behavioral scientist, so I work with an international team of researchers, innovators, public policy people to try to understand what stands in the way of us meeting our goals and how can we overcome those challenges. I've been doing this research for over 20 years, and every day is a new discovery. I love it. So I live in New York City right now, and but I grew up in the middle of the United States in Nebraska.
What attracted you to New York City? Why not continue in Nebraska with everything?
We needed a change. I had, grew up there, spent my life there, but then, where the opportunity was to go to school and to get my PhD was not in Nebraska. So I went and did my PhD at Cornell University in upstate New York. My first academic position as a faculty member was in Ohio, and then after a few years, an opportunity came. And on my 30th birthday, I moved to New York City, and it was a great birthday present, a great way to turn a new decade.
The reason I ask is obviously the title of your book. Was there any reason because of the title of your book that you got attracted to New York? Because we obviously hear the stories. I've watched Suits. So the stereotype of New York is that a lot of successful people, workaholics, tend to be there. Was there a correlation there, or was it just random that you ended up in New York?
It wasn't random that I ended up in New York, but I was in New York for a lot longer than the conception of the book. But there's successful people that are everywhere. I mean, New York has certainly an eclectic assortment of all different kinds of people, many of whom are successful. But what's amazing is as we travel around the world and present this work, or have the opportunity to meet other organizations, you find incredibly successful people all over the place, places you've never heard of, places you've definitely heard of. So New York isn't necessarily special in that regard.
That's good to hear. So I have a question surrounding kind of your research. What is a common misconception when people look at your research or see the title of your book? How would you describe what you do, and what are those misconceptions, and how would you counter them?
I'm not a clinical psychologist, so that's a misconception. This isn't a self-help book, although it can certainly help the self. But, I'm not here to look at you, to have this conversation and then know how much you did or didn't get along with your mother when you were a child. That's not what we do. We're conducting rigorous experimental studies to understand what is it about the social circumstances that people find themselves in, their past history of success and failures that might lead to problems that they're experiencing in the future as they're working to take on a new goal that they might have. We're testing interventions, looking to see what demographic are they going to be more or less successful for, and then collecting data, not based on our intuitions. We're not basing these conclusions on case studies, but on large-scale studies of many different swaths of different kinds of people in different social circumstances to know for sure, to know the truth, using the principles of scientific investigation, what works and what doesn't.
So then I learned from stories, which is why I was so excited for this podcast. You have a ton of them. Can you share some of the stories, maybe how the stories have evolved that led to the book? Kind of take us to the beginning. What got you into it? What were the first stories that got you to research? What were some of the first research things that you did?
Sure. So, the research came first and the stories came later. So, as I have conversations with people and share our insights that we gathered from our experimental studies and their publications, people come to me and say, that resonates with me. I use that when I'm training for, the 100-meter sprint in the Olympics, or I use that when I was transitioning from one company to the other company. So that has been really exciting, is to see, like, when I talk about the research, what stories come to me. And I found those absolutely fascinating. And then it started to become a more iterative process of do the science, find the people, listen to their stories, and then change up the science. But a lot of this work really started first with understanding health and fitness. This is people's number one personal goal. January 1st, New Year's resolutions, it continues to be at the top of the list of things that people are concerned about. How can I live a healthier, happier life? And what is standing in my way? And this year is my year for changing that. So our work really first focused in that area. What we were finding is that people need to move more. We have such a sedentary life compared to decades ago, and especially during the last 2 years of the pandemic. We just sit. We sit and we look at screens, and that's not healthy. That doesn't help us meet our goals for living a satisfying life. So people need to move more, but of course that can be challenging because you can't find the time, you don't have the motivation. It's sort of a back and forth process where you feel like I'm out of shape, so it hurts to exercise, but of course to fix that I need to exercise. So we were looking at ways that we could increase not only the number of times that people go out for a walk or for a run, but their appraisal of it. How was this experience? Did it hurt? Did it defy my expectations? Was it worse or better than I thought? And when we can change that, appraisal or that mindset, we might be able to have a long-lasting impact. And we found that that's the case. We found that there's an effective intervention that is designed around how people look at the world around them. And it can improve the quality of exercise for all kinds of people. Those that are coming in much heavier than they want to be, those people whose motivation is struggling. It works for people who are already incredibly accomplished athletes but want to up their performance a little bit more. And what it is that we taught people to, in a sense, keep their eyes on the prize. Now, that's like a metaphor, right? We talk about that. We use that phrase all the time when we're thinking about what are our goals and don't get distracted, keep cognitively focused, just have our thoughts trained on this thing that we're working on. But in this context, when it came to exercise, we meant it quite literally. Pick a target, pick a stop sign, pick a building up ahead that has a mural on it, and focus your eyes on it. Ignore the buildings on the side or the people that are on the sidewalk on the opposite side of the street. Just keep your eyes focused on that target. Consider it to be like a finish line. Maybe it is literally your finish line, but focus your eyes there. Now that we tested in comparison to our baseline condition of just letting people look around the world as they naturally do, whatever that means for them. But we suspected it wasn't with such a narrow focus, and we were right. Now, what we found was that there's a whole host of cascading effects from keeping their eyes on the prize, staying narrowly focused on what their goal is. What we found is that it produced a visual illusion. It made that finish line appear physically closer to them than if they were looking around the world the way that they naturally would. That finish line, that goal, looked closer to the self. Now, what does that do? Well, it changes all kinds of aspects of their mindset. Now it seems more feasible. It seems more possible. It seems like I have in me what I need to make it there. I think I can do this. This isn't so difficult. And when you change that mindset, performance differences followed. People ran and walked faster. In fact, they increased the rate of their movement by 23%. They also said it didn't hurt as much. Nothing about the task changed. It was the same for everybody. Everybody was running the same distance. They were moving the same distance. We had set that constraint as something that everybody had the same experience for. But they said it hurt 17% less. And that's all because of this shift in mindset. We changed what their eyes were doing. It changed the way they saw the world around them. And then it opened up a whole host of possibilities for them that had a direct impact on the thing that they had been struggling with the most. Now that was really exciting. We replicated it a number of times. We tested it on all kinds of people, and we found that it works always. This is an effective strategy that so many people can use. It costs nothing. It's easily implementable. It's not confusing. And it's scalable. People can do this one time. They can see improvements and be motivated and excited to continue to do it. But it works outside of exercise as well. Because what we're talking about here in the context of exercise is physical space, physical distance that's separating me from where I want to be. But in lots of goals, there is some aspect of that experience as well. Here's where my business is at. Here's where I want it to be in 10 years' time. Now that to some people might seem like extremely far off, and there's challenges when we set those long-term kinds of goals. We get distracted, we get pulled in other directions, we might find ourselves multitasking more than perhaps is beneficial. And what we found is that when we have people use that same sort of visual strategy, visualize what 10 years from now looks like. What does it look like when you're at that place in the development of your goal or of your personal life or your professional life? When that goal would come to fruition, what does that look like? Now, when we do that, what we found is that we contracted that temporal space or that psychological distance that separates me from future me, current me from future me. And when that happens, people make choices that better align with their long-term prospects, with their long-term objectives, rather than the short-term immediate rewards that might prove detrimental to their long-term goals. So where did the work start? That was a long-winded answer to your question. It started with exercise. We tested it with people who are really struggling to meet their health and fitness goals, but we found that this is a tactic that's used by and is even effective for some of the world's most fastest runners, those that literally were competing in the last Olympics before we were testing these ideas. This is a strategy that works for people who were overweight and really trying this year to make some change. But it has far-reaching consequences for goals that are well outside the domain of health and fitness. When we think about long-term goals, often that distance is the problem or produces the problems that we might need to solve.
As you're telling this story, I'm thinking super valuable, of course, that there's actual scientific research around this. The question that pops up to me is, it sounds like it's like common knowledge where it's bite-sized things. So you have a big goal, but you have milestones to get there. You visualize them, especially with athletes. Visualization seems to be very popular. The question that pops up for me, though, is how do you start? Because a lot of people have even trouble starting. They might visualize a goal, maybe running a marathon, but then, they go outside the first day, and then I feel like once you're already outside, so you actually got up out of the couch, and you're starting to run, you can now make that distance longer, have less pain, stuff like that. But how do you actually get off the couch? Did you look into that part?
Sure. So I just wanted to react to something you said, which is that this seems intuitive, and I'm glad that it does, because that will make it easier for you or for anybody to want to adopt it if it feels like, oh, this is already part of my repertoire. But let me remind you that it's not common. It's not a common practice for how at least people approach the exercise, right? Because the comparison was do what you naturally do, and that was not effective, right? People walked slower, they ran slower, they said it hurt, and they didn't repeat the exercise in the weeks to come when we were looking at their performance with the apps that they use to track their own exercise. So when we let them do what's natural is to assume a more expansive attention, to use distraction. And that also seems intuitive. Okay, when I'm exercising, I got to go 30 minutes, but I really only feel like my body can handle 20. And so I should distract myself to try to get my mind out of that context of this hurts, this hurts, this hurts. And we found that didn't work as much as choosing these smaller goals and working towards those smaller goals, meeting it, and then resetting another smaller goal. So both of those, you can, when you hear them, you say oh yeah, that makes sense. That resonates with me. I do that. I think that would work. But you can do that in both cases, right? You can do that both with like this distraction or a wider mindset or a multitasking idea about how to approach my goals. And you can come up with those explanations for why it would be effective also to be narrowly focused. And that is natural, that humans do that we start thinking about an idea that we think would work, and then we look for support. That's called confirmation bias. That's what our brain does naturally. We have an idea that we think would be right, and then we just start searching for all the examples and evidence that would support that. But in this case, confirmation bias would tell us that both of these possibilities are right, which is why science is wonderful, because it can help us distinguish between two ideas that our intuition tells us would both be effective. Your second question then is, how do we do that? How do you take a big goal and get off the couch, take that first step? And the same tactics that worked for those people that were exercising or trying to exercise after having, come from a state where it would be really challenging to now, trying to up their game it is to set these smaller goals. So when I'm saying like choose a stop sign or choose a building that has an interesting mural and focus on it, that might push them an extra 2 minutes, but we need people to do it for an extra 10 minutes, for an extra day, for another week, and to keep this going for months to come. So what we're doing is taking that big goal and breaking it down into a smaller bite-sized chunk. That's the same strategy that's effective for all different kinds of goals. We can't just stop with setting a long-term goal and thinking that having put that positive energy out there of this is what I want to accomplish, that we're going to accomplish it. And in fact, there's lots of evidence that suggests if we do that, if we just set this ambitious long-term goal that's really exciting, and even if we remind ourselves of it every day and we use it as our inspiration to determine what is it that we're going to do today, we are actually, in some cases, even less likely to accomplish that goal than if we hadn't put that lofty objective out there. Some people, talk about that like goal setting at the high level as, maybe they manifest that by creating vision boards. That's a common term and a common practice, and especially among millennials, people in their 20s and 30s who are starting businesses. The vast majority of millennials, when asked by TD Bank in a fairly recent survey, said that they use vision boards to craft a vision, craft an idea of where they want their business to go. More than 3 out of 4 millennials use vision boards to decide whether to start a business in the first place. And the vast majority think it's an effective way of communicating to their teammates or to their coworkers where this organization is moving. And that's true. That's true that it can be effective for communication, and it can certainly be helpful for trying to create an idea or to brainstorm possibilities for what the future might look like. But it's actually not helpful in accomplishing the goal in the long run. Colleagues of mine at New York University found that when people do that, when they just start envisioning or brainstorming over that long-term objective, that they feel good about it. And that's fine. That's true. That I'm sure we all feel that way, that an effective brainstorming session can really increase our feelings of positivity. But the problem is that we can mentally savor that experience and it produces sort of a vicarious satisfaction of the goal. We start feeling like this is mission accomplished. Now I know what I want out of life. I know where I'm going. And that produces a satisfaction that can lead us to sort of to rest, to lay back on our laurels, feeling like we've accomplished something that's really important. These colleagues of mine studied systolic blood pressure. And systolic blood pressure, it's the top number on your blood pressure reading. But more than that, psychologically, it's an indicator of mobilization, of our body's readiness to get up and go. When we're on the brink of doing something, that something can be physical, like running, or it could be mental, like doing a bunch of math problems. Systolic blood pressure increases in anticipation of doing something that's going to require either our physical or cognitive resources. But what they found is that when people daydreamed and thought about what would it look like when I accomplish this long-term goal that really matters to me, systolic blood pressure decreased. It went down because they were experiencing that sort of goal-satisfied moment. I know what I want out of my life. I know where I'm working towards, and now I can take a rest. But we need that mobilization. We need that energy so that we can translate our big picture ideas into the concrete actions that we need to take to actually make progress. So I caution us about thinking that, putting it out there, creating a vision board is actually going to increase the odds of success unless we do more than that. It's not bad to articulate where is it that I want to go in 5 years, or to create sort of a scrapbook of imagery that reflects what my ideals for a business are. That's not a bad idea in and of itself. It's just that it has to be coupled with the next steps of effective goal setting. And I'm happy to talk about those when they come up. But just a word of caution of dreaming big is great, but if you stop there, you actually do a disservice to the odds of meeting your goals.
So much to unpack. We're definitely going to go into that second phase. But in short, from what I understand is when you're creating, let's say, a vision board, or you draw on a whiteboard something with a goal in mind, and then you add some pictures to that, which could be like a vision board, you should definitely not only focus on that. Once it's there, but then maybe it's better for you to store it somewhere under your bed or something, or in a vault, and not actually look at it, but look at the next small goal in front of you. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think you have to store it. Some people really, I've been in organizations where I see their mission statements where it's just like, a pithy articulation of what their long-term vision is. I mean, it's literally plastered as a mural outside on the first wall you see when you get off the elevators. That's not a bad idea. To do that. And it's not a bad idea if you created a vision board and you put it up in your bathroom wall, which a lot of people are inclined to do for their own personal goals. It's that what should be paired with that articulation of the big vision is the concrete steps of action that you can take this week, right? It's we need to have that synergy. We need to make the connections between this is what I'm working towards that will bring happiness or success or whatever the objectives are, and this is what I need to do to make that happen. And that pairing has to happen. The pairing requires work, though, right? I mean, that means that we need to be revisiting our goals, we need to be thinking about what the steps are, and we need to be continuously updating basically that to-do list, so that we're always pairing the long-term objective with this week's concrete steps that I can take to get there.
Before we dive into the concrete steps, I also want to ask regarding the blood pressure part that you mentioned. So you mentioned that when people look at their vision board, their blood pressure is going down, which is paired with this feeling as if you've accomplished the goal already, even though you haven't actually worked on it yet. But the question that I would have to that is, what if that's a good thing for stress, and are you artificially simulating more stress on purpose then to achieve goals, and is that healthy or not?
Sure, yeah, managing stress, of course, is really important, and you're totally right that if what I'm espousing or what I'm suggesting is a tactic that keeps us living at chronically higher levels of stress, that's bad. That would be bad. And that's, but we need to be thinking about, well, what is the goal here? If the goal is to accomplish this 5-year plan or this objective, then just thinking about what do I want in my life is not going to be effective for meeting that goal. But if the goal is reducing stress, well, then there's a whole host of other tactics, right? We actually need a little bit of stress. Stress is manifested in the same way as excitement or mobilization, or action readiness for the things that we need to do to get our job done, to meet our goals. So stress, can be operationalized, or it can be like manifested in our body as cortisol. We've heard about, that fight or flight response in our body. And what that means is that our body is sort of flushed with cortisol, a hormone that our brain is responsible for producing, that can get us to be able to quickly jump out of harm's way or to run if that's what we need. Cortisol is a marker of stress. But cortisol actually is at its peak when we wake up in the morning. Right? So what helps us transition from our state of unconsciousness and sleep to consciousness or alertness or being awake in the morning is actually an increase in cortisol. So we need that. We actually need that stress hormone to help us do some of the most important things in the day, like get up, right? So just knowing, so our goal should not be to always keep stress as low as possible, because what stress is are hormones that are necessary for other functions as well, like getting up or like getting our body excited and ready and prepared to do something that might be cognitively or physically challenging. So our goal can't always be stress management, because if that is our exclusive goal, then it's going to come at the expense of other, responses that our body has to help us get other aspects of our life accomplished.
I really like that answer. I wanted to ask then, I've known some people, especially in entrepreneurship, it's such a big thing, have experienced burnout. And many of my friends, I was at one point, I think maybe even close to burnouts. I think you never know until you've actually experienced it. But many of them have the reaction to completely swing the pendulum the other way. The stress management that you were just explaining. How do you tell them to, incorporate stress back into their lives, but in a way that is healthy? When is it healthy? How do you know? And when is it too much? And how can you, not go there?
Right. Burnout is a real thing. And I don't need to convince you or anybody who is listening to this of that. There's a little bit more interesting nuance that comes with the cortisol work when we're talking about burnout and people who are likely to experience burnout. What is it? Am I prone to it? Am I on the brink of burnout? You can probably feel that for yourself when it just feels like this is intolerable. I can't sustain this pace, or this stress is just eating away at me. People have designed surveys to try to help people self-assess whether they're on the brink of burnout, and it might be something like, when my personal life throws challenges at me that require my full attention, I can't put work aside. I won't change my professional priorities to manage the personal obligations that have increased in scale or in scope. If you feel like that reflects your life, if that resonates with you, the job won't wait for me, even if my life is requiring more of me right now. If you feel like that is true, you are prone to experiencing burnout, right? Because that's just not sustainable, right? There has to be balance. Even for the people that have the most demanding of jobs or the most demanding of personal lives, there still has to be some sort of, give and take with how much investment we put into our careers versus our personal life. And that has to be flexible because responsibilities and obligations and demands change. But for some people, they don't believe that that's true. They don't feel like they can. If something personal comes up, they can't tune it back on their professional life. And when they agree with those kinds of statements, people who do agree with those kinds of statements, when researchers have measured their cortisol levels, what they found is that, like everyone else, the cortisol levels are highest in the morning, in the first hour of waking up, again, because that's what transitions us from being asleep to being awake. But at every time point for the rest of the day, every 3 hours or so when the cortisol cortisol levels were measured, people who said, yeah, I can't turn down my professional life when personal obligations require more of me, had significantly higher levels of cortisol. They were literally living with higher levels of stress as manifested by cortisol. So I'm saying, cortisol is not all bad because it's important for things like getting up. But it is bad if we are chronically living at a higher state of cortisol. For people who can disengage, for people who are more flexible in balancing their personal and professional lives, we see that cortisol is highest at the beginning of the day and then drops dramatically over the course of the day to prepare them for falling asleep at the end of the night. But for people who have a hard time disengaging, who are on the brink of experiencing burnout, they are just at every step of the way higher in their cortisol levels. What does that mean? There's an effect of living with higher cortisol throughout the course of your day for a sustained period of time. It leads to inflammation. And I'm not just talking about like sore muscles like after you've gone for a run, but I'm talking about all the cells in your body are experiencing inflammation. They're bigger, and that is a precursor to cancer. So living at higher levels of stress has been linked to increased risk of various forms of cancer. For heart disease, you're increasing your odds of having a stroke because of that higher cortisol. So the big question then is, what do we do about that? If I'm on the brink of burnout, what am I supposed to do? Well, first of all, acknowledge that actually is a health risk. It's not just a risk to your professional development, but you're putting your life on the line. Some people might think of it as sort of a badge, right? This is a badge of honor. I've got grit. Look how stressful my life is, and I will push on. Now, that in some respects and in some degree is necessary for incredible accomplishments, doing something that nobody has ever done before. That sort of perseverance despite obstacles often characterizes some of probably our biggest idols, our heroes. The most successful entrepreneurs have that kind of get up and go, and I'm going to get the job done. But it can reach a tipping point. It can reach a tipping point where it's no longer healthy. It's no longer the right course of action to move through obstacles because of the physical toll that it puts on our body. So recognizing that, yes, it might be one of the qualities in you that has led you to be as successful and capable and productive as you have been, but you have to be flexible in the use of that tool, that personality quality that you have. That can help you do amazing things, but you can't be living at that state for every part of your day, for your whole life, because it is literally taking a physical toll on your body that might jeopardize your longevity.
So for those entrepreneurs who have experienced it, or maybe they've worked so hard in their business, sold the business, and are now kind of they don't even know if they want to be entrepreneurs because it's so much work. How do you tell them to pick it up in a healthy way? So is what you're saying, am I deducting right that what you're saying is pick it back up, but make sure that you stop working at 5 o'clock or something like that? That there is an on and off switch, or what are you exactly saying for them?
Right. So there's no one formula that's going to be effective for any person in all situations. If somebody tries to offer you that, or if it sounds like I'm suggesting that, then they're selling you a can of snake oil, because that's not the case. There is no one prescription that's going to be effective for everybody in every circumstance. But here are two possibilities to consider. One is putting boundaries on yourself, like you've just suggested. At 5 o'clock, I will turn it off. Right. And not just I'll turn off my computer, but turn it off mentally as well. You need to fully invest yourself into something else that is as interesting to you as your job is. Right. So it's not just I'll turn my computer off and then I'll go home, but I'll stew over the problems that I was trying to work through at work while I'm trying to have dinner with, my girlfriend or with my husband or take my child out. You need to find something that will be as mentally consuming in a fun way, that exercises a different part of your brain that helps you reduce that stress, right? So just setting that kind of boundary of my day will end at 5 o'clock and then I'll go have some personal time, whatever that means. Think about how you're structuring that personal time and recognize that if it's not as interesting for your brain is not going to leave work, behind just because your computer is off. So taking note of that, throw your brain into something as exciting, as interesting and engaging as the thing that you need to pull yourself away from. For some people, that's intense physical activity as well. Yeah.
So would that be something like, you said physical activity, would that be something like a sports that you're interested in? But then my argument to that would be, doesn't that also raise cortisol if you're really obsessed with it?
So sports are a good example because it does require cognitive focus, right? I mean, think about yoga is a good example. When you're pushing yourself to some, beyond the beginner level of yoga, you're doing things like headstands or balance movements that actually could cause some, physical complications if you don't get it right. If you let your mind wander, if you let your eye gaze wander around the room, you're going to fall over and you can really hurt your neck, for example, in some of those instances. So, that's an example of a physical activity that demands for your health and safety that you remain present in the here and now. And that is a strategy that you can use to pull yourself out of what it is that you want to leave behind now, put work behind, and throw yourself intensely into something else. Yeah, it can increase cortisol, but it also increases all kinds of other things like endorphins. Endorphins are what feelings of happiness are. If you find if it's something that involves like human touch, like yoga with your partner, you can increase oxytocin, which is the chemical marker of love, right? So yeah, it can be physically taxing on your body, but it is not at the exclusion of all these other wonderful hormones that our body can produce that give rise to the positive experiences that we're trying to fill our life with. So that's one strategy, is just acknowledge that, like, yep, you might need to put some boundaries on yourself and have a hard and fast cutoff, but that might not be enough to actually get the job done of giving yourself a distraction or a break. The second thing is that, a daily cutoff might not be enough to rejuvenate or refill your reserves, right? If you really do feel like this is too much, this isn't sustainable, this is burnout for me. Giving yourself an extra half an hour or 2 hours at the end of the day is probably not going to be enough to fix that feeling. It might need a week. It might need a month. It might need 6 months. And that is not a sign of failure, right? That is not a sign that you have failed, or that there's mental illness, or that there's something wrong with you. That can be a healthy and in fact super productive strategy for finding what is the next path forward. We get so myopically focused. I was saying that was a good thing when it came to exercise, but when we're trying to brainstorm new solutions, new endeavors, new possibilities, and innovate in ways that we never have before, myopically focused just keeps us on the same course of action, literally on the same path to the finish line. But that's not always effective. Sometimes we need to think of an entirely new plan of action, or a new possibility for productivity or for what the job requires. And that's not going to happen if we just give ourselves an extra half an hour every day or 5 days a week to try to carve out that time for pulling ourselves out of this myopic focus. You've heard of Vera Wang. Almost everybody has heard of Vera Wang, incredibly successful fashion designer, right? She's like the wedding dress queen. But as successful as her fashion house is, that's not where she started. Her life started actually as a figure skater. She was really successful in figure skating. I had no idea until I started diving into her backstory. She was winning national and international competitions. She was doing, doubles figure skating, and that was what she thought her life calling would be. But she hit a point in her career where she wasn't the top. There was still room to go, but it just doesn't seem like it was possible. She kept competing and wasn't getting first place. She wasn't making it to the peak level of, and that was what her aspiration was. And so she gave herself a year. She took a year off. She left figure skating behind and she moved to a different country. She went to the Sorbonne in Paris and just thought, like, what do I want? What is it that I really want in my life? And that's when she turned to fashion. Now that might, for some people, seem like completely different. You go from figure skating to now, designing and cutting fabric and making wedding dresses. Like, maybe sequins are both involved, but maybe that's where the similarity ends. But for her, it was not. It was not failing at figure skating and then restarting an entirely new career. It was coming out of that myopic focus. It was saying, what is my love? What is my passion? And for her, it's the art of line, L-I-N-E, right? That's what I'm passionate about. And I can carve it into the ice or I can cut it out of fabric. And so it was finding an entirely new medium for what has always been her passion or for her goal. And that wasn't going to happen as she just reflected on, how did this competition go? How am I preparing for the next one? She needed to take herself out of the setting that she was in. She moved to a new country and give herself a year to think about it and to get out of that narrowed focus that had been her career and her life's trajectory up until that point in time. So I think that's a second point, is that recognizing that actually to take it to the next level might require that you take a major break, a major step back to get out of our routine, get out of the habit, get out of that normal way of thinking that has led us to continue on a relatively straight and narrow path.
Very relevant question then to what you were saying before we move on to the next part is, when do you know you're out of a burnout? So you've mentioned how you can feel that you're in a burnout. when do you know you're out of a burnout? And you mentioned, it could be a day, a week, a month, it could be 6 months at one point you mentioned. So, many people can't afford to go for a year to Paris. They're experiencing burnout. They need to take a break, but they don't know. Maybe they have to tell their boss how long that break is. So, and they don't know. So the question would be, what is the average, I guess, for a burnout to recover? I know you said, most people are different. So then my other question to that would be, when do you know you're safe to get out of that burnout mindset and start working again?
I don't know of anybody who has ever tried to quantify that. How long does a burnout last? Maybe somebody could try to do some sort of average, but that would just not even be that useful for whoever is reading that answer. Again, because each circumstance really is going to be quite different. Have you been working on this goal for 10 years? Are you the leader of this organization? Is this your entrepreneurship or not, right? Everybody can experience burnout, whether you're the leader or whether you're a member of an organization. You don't have to have the title of CEO to experience burnout. Everybody does. But how it manifests itself and for how long is going to be really different. It depends on things like social support. How much support do you have to help you work through this real and legitimate challenge? So social support could determine how long or short of a period of time that this lasts. And like you're saying, the resources available to refill your energetic coffers is also going to be part of it. And so I don't have the answer to that. And but how do you know if you're out of it? I think you can introspect about that. I think you can look inside and be your own clinical psychologist. Of course, you can use clinical psychologists or therapists to help you with that introspection, but we can do it for ourselves too. Do you feel, when you wake up in the day, do you feel excited to go back to your job? Do you, when it's Sunday becoming Monday, are you like, ugh, I hate Mondays. If you feel like I am saying that with the same passion that I said that before, you're probably still burned out, right? I mean, of course, everybody would love to have ample free time and never have to do the dirty work of a job, even a job that they love. So maybe everybody loves weekends more than they love Mondays. But if you have been rejuvenated, if you feel, if you're getting that sense of like, there are parts of Monday that I'm looking forward to. I'm excited to get back and working with my team. I've got some ideas I can't wait to share with people. If that kind of language starts coming into your mind, then you're probably recovering. You're on the road to recovery from burnout. Yeah.
So then you start feeling excited again. You have some ideas. Out of personal experience, and I've seen it again also with friends, I would say to that, a lot of these entrepreneurs tend to get excited before they're recovered. So, and one of the things associated with getting back into work, is the fear that, I'm getting a bit too excited here, I'm going to work again too hard. And because of that, there's this fear, and so they don't even try. They take another month off or another month off, and suddenly, you don't really know when to start. Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, it does. And it comes back to where we started at the beginning of this conversation, which is about goal setting. Articulating what is our big vision for what we want to accomplish, breaking it down into manageable, concrete objectives that we can assess our progress. Have we met this goal? Have we not met this goal? There's another aspect to goal setting that I want to make sure we put on the table. But directly to answer your question, if the problem is that that feeling of excitement and energization may not actually be the marker of readiness to start again, I think, again, people can recognize, does that describe me? Is that the case that produces problems for me? And if the answer is yes, then we need to go back to those basic foundational elements of effective goal setting. What's the high-level goal? What's the 5-year plan? What's the long-term objective? What are the concrete, actionable, measurable goals that I have right now? And then, of course, importantly, to assess progress on those more measurable, concrete objectives. And what we can do is just set up reasonable expectations for ourselves about what those concrete goals should look like, and not push ourselves or reward ourselves to exceed those concrete goals. if the problem is throwing ourselves too much so into the project or to the next idea, that we put far more in than is reasonable to sustain over the long term, then we need to use our checks and balances, our moments of checking in with those concrete goals to say, like, you know what, I hit my mark. And now I'm going to let myself feel that. I'm going to be excited. And I'm not going to say, like, okay, quickly, let's move on to the next one. Then I'm ahead of schedule, and to feel proud about being ahead of schedule. That one can, but that might be the problem, is that hit of meeting a goal and then quickly wanting to move on to the next goal and then feeling great that I'm ahead of where I wanted to be, might be something that we need to remind ourselves is the problem. Right? Where does burnout come from? Throwing ourselves too much into something that we, at a pace or an investment that I can't hold on to for the long term that this goal will require. So setting that high level vision, what is a reasonable, 1 week, 1 month, 2 month, quarterly set of goals. Every 2 weeks, check in with those goals. If you're coming up short, thinking about, well, what's standing in my way of meeting these concrete action items. But if you're hitting them, then don't try to increase the pace. Like, allow yourself to just see, okay, I'm at this place. Let's see how it pans out right now. And then recalibrate for when should I be starting on phase 2. And I'm not going to just do it tomorrow. I'm going to wait the week. If I'm a week ahead of schedule, if I'm a month ahead of schedule, let's just let this sit for a week and see what happens. And that might be a way to proactively manage what might eventually turn into burnout. If that's the problem for you, is working at a frenetic pace, trying to meet and then exceed our expectations for ourselves, putting restrictions or trying to scale that back, and knowing that, beating our objectives isn't going to be helpful for sustaining the energy that we need to get a long-term goal accomplished.
So what you're saying is, if you're working faster than the pace you set, then you should also plan in some type of vacation in there as well. For, let's say you're 2 days early done, then just take 2 days off for that week.
Yeah, literally that could be what it means, is that you take vacation time, or you just let the product or the idea development just sort of ferment there. Let it just sit and see what happens. Because when we keep trying to change and manipulate and control the course of action of an idea or of a team, we don't allow, just naturally occurring events to happen, to unfold, for us to learn from spontaneity or from a change in culture or something that happens in our communities that might shift the course of how a product lands or how people react to an idea. If we're ahead of schedule, we can give ourselves that beauty, that luxury of just, like, let's see what happens naturally. Let's let evolution happen for these next 2 days. Yes, you could go on vacation. Maybe you can do it simultaneously as, like, let this sit. Let your team let the idea sit and see what maybe sparks or comes out of left field, when they aren't having to just continually walk the line to meet the next goal and then meet the next goal and then meet the next goal. Like, evolution of an idea can happen spontaneously as well if we give it space to do that.
Mm-hmm. So then, if you're looking at startup life, a lot of these people obviously hit their goals, want to go move on to the next goal because they have to hit, certain monetary goals. A lot of startups don't have money and need money. But then what you would say is, when you're creating your goals, make sure that they are realistic also to the startup life, so that you have enough money coming in, and that you just focus, I guess, on having enough money to pay everybody. And then once you have your basic needs covered, make sure that you also take a break, something along those lines, right?
Yeah, it is, right? So if you're, making payroll happen, you've got the rent covered, you have enough money for research and development, then don't feel like that you have to now, tomorrow, start trying to hit the next financial objective. If you've met that mark, then feel the sense of security that comes from that. And that can be the time when you allow yourself to think more expansively, rather than being so narrowly focused on just getting more money, right? That's not the only objective. Having something that's creative, that's different, that lands in a new way within the market space that you're in is also important. And that's ideas. And ideas require time, and they require space to develop.
Maybe then a more personal question before we again get to the second part. I grew up very poor. And I know that a lot of successful people that I know, friends as well, also grew up very, very poor. One of the things that we have in common is we're very kind of focused on the money, but not for the money's sake, more for our sense of security's sake. So it almost feels like, let's say last month was a great month and payroll and everything had been hit. But the next month, I have a new sheet open because everything is on zero again. How do you mentally kind of wrap yourself around the fact that you are secure when I guess what I'm saying right now is that there's a lot to deal with from your youth to now? Or have you encountered this during your research with successful people, and how did they handle that?
Yeah, thanks for sharing your story there. A suggestion for that would be to consider developing a personal board of directors. Companies have boards of directors to help shape the course of action for their company, but you can have one personally as well. Those people that reflect your past, who would understand why is this the first goal that you keep coming back to? Why is it that you're focused on the money? And they will understand that, right? So maybe somebody from your past needs to be on your personal board of directors, but maybe somebody who has a completely different background than you, one who came from ample resources and for whom that doesn't really resonate with them, but that you can have a candid, psychologically safe conversation with. They need to be a part of your board of directors as well, so that they can put that into check and offer you a different perspective or question, why is it that you keep coming back to talking about payroll? Why is it that you hit your quarterly goal within the first 2 months, and now you're already working on the next quarter's goals? Like, why don't you use this as an opportunity to transition to what your second most important goal is, which we've talked about is X instead, right? So you might consider developing that personal board of directors to help you play devil's advocate with how you're prioritizing your goals personally. That can have a conversation outside of you talking with your colleagues or your coworkers or other members of your organization that that you can listen to when they say you're making a mistake, right? Your focus on money here is a mistake, or your focus on money is totally understandable and it's coming at this cost. So let's talk about that, right? I mean, it sounds like therapy in a sense, and maybe you think about it that way if that works for you. But you can also think about it like every major successful organization has trustees, boards of directors, people that offer alternative perspectives to, a unilateral decision maker's course of action. And so, and we all have baggage from our youth that are making ideas or reactions or ways of operating really accessible. And it can be helpful to have somebody that we trust and that we will listen to tell us this is not working.
I mean, if I look kind of at how I'm handling it and I handled it, I feel like every week I have a business coach. So I guess that's partially my personal board. And then I also have an accountability buddy, somebody that I call with every Sunday who's like my peer, also an entrepreneur. And I feel like when you're saying that, that's, I guess, my personal board, and they've really helped me get through those issues as well. So that's really nice that that's a solution. Maybe also for the listeners. Very practical question before we move on to the second part of the goal setting. You mentioned measuring cortisol. Is there any way that an average, person can measure their own cortisol at home, and in sort of an inexpensive way?
Not really. There isn't really an at-home testing kit where, you can collect it through saliva, but then it has to get sent away to a lab that can measure that particular hormone that appears in the saliva. But you can take your heart rate, you can take your blood pressure, and that might be something interesting for people to try if they're wondering how is my stress changing over time. Like, stress manifests in cortisol, but it also manifests in sweaty palms. It manifests in increased heart rate, increase in like how many beats per minute is your heart operating at, and what's your blood pressure? How hard is it contracting to push blood through your body? And those are things that are easily measurable. And that might be interesting to do for, a 2-week period of time. Set a reminder on your phone every hour, check in with your heart, check in with your palms, and document it. Keep data on yourself about what your body is doing. Maybe accompany that with sort of a description about what's happening right now. What am I thinking about? What's the task that I've taken on? And then after 2 weeks, after a month or something, download all that data and try to find some commonalities that's leading to when your heart rate is the highest or when your blood pressure is the highest. Are there common denominators in what you're thinking about or what you're taking on right now that's contributing to some of the highest markers of stress that a normal everyday person without a lab could measure? For something I haven't tried that exercise myself, but there were other things that I was trying to measure when I was assessing stress. I had taken on a big goal in the book that I talk about. I set a personal goal for myself, and it was exciting to take on, but it was also causing me a lot of stress because I wasn't making really good progress on it. But I had committed to my publisher and my editor that I was going to make this thing happen. So I was feeling that stress. And so I just, I downloaded this app. There's lots of different kinds of apps like this that will randomly, pull up a questionnaire on your phone. It will ask you like, hey, have you done, in this case, have you practiced, have you made any progress on this personal goal that you have? Since the last time I asked you, have you done anything about it? And I'd say yes or no. And then if I had said like yes, it would say, okay, what and when and how did you feel about it? And when I thought about my experience, I thought like I am making no progress, and that is leading me to feel really stressed out that I'm getting nowhere with this goal that matters in several regards. But after I had that experience of my phone asking me 4 or 5 times a day, have you done anything about it? How are you feeling right now? And then I looked for a month, I saw changes. I saw a trajectory that I couldn't experience or feel in the moment. So even though, as I thought about it and appraised my progress, I thought I'm getting nowhere with this and I'm totally stressed out about it. When I look over the course of a month, I actually had spent more time and practiced more than my brain gave myself credit for, more than I could remember, because our brains, our memories are incredibly faulty in a way that is advantageous in some circumstances, but in this case wasn't. And I could show a trajectory of improvement when I had recorded, like, how are you feeling right now? Are you feeling stressed out? Are you feeling calm? Are you feeling like you had made some progress? That I couldn't see that change over time in the here and now. It required me to take a step back and look at a month's worth of low-level, minute data to find what was a clear, linear, positive trajectory. So you can do that with your blood pressure, your heart rate, or just a reporting on how sweaty are your palms right now. And you might find patterns in your own behavior and what's causing that stress that you wouldn't be able to remember or to report on in the moment.
If you're checking just blood pressure, is that enough, or does it have to be in combination with your heart rate? And also a question, what do you think about heart rate variability?
So yeah, that's a great question. There's no, probably just measuring your blood pressure is not going to be enough for you to know, am I stressed out? Am I in danger of getting cancer? No, there isn't going to be one single indicator that's going to give you a direct connection to some consequential outcome like that, right? It is a constellation of factors that will have some probabilistic relationship to those kinds of big outcomes. But it's better than nothing, right? It's better than not doing anything to try to assess how am I feeling? How is my body reacting to the circumstances that I'm putting it in? So I still think that and it doesn't cost very much. It doesn't cost much of your time or your money to try to measure and track that kind of a thing if it's of interest to you. So I think it's, low investment, possibly interesting, moderate returns on that. heart rate variability. Do you want to talk about what that is in case some of your listeners aren't familiar with it?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Would you like to describe it, or should I jump in here?
No, I'm not a scientist, so I would love to hear everything from the beginning to also what's your interpretation, and maybe also add to that the wearables that are out there right now. How realistic do they show heart rate variability?
Yeah. Okay, so heart rate variability nicely is kind of what its name suggests. It's how variable is your heart rate over the course of the day and with different experiences. We want our heart rate to be variable. So if we're just about to go out for a run and we want to be good at it, we want to win a race, we need our heart rate to go up, right? So that we can pump more blood and hence oxygen throughout different parts of our body. So we want that kind of variability when we're about to take on something that would be taxing. We also want heart rate variability when we need to relax, when we're done with that run, or we're done with this intense investment right now and maybe a very important like pitch meeting, right? Our heart rate will go up, but when that meeting is over, we need the heart rate to go down. So we need the stress to come down when the situation has changed and we don't need the stress to function. So heart rate variability is a good thing. It can be an indicator that our bodies are responding to the challenges that the situation has placed upon it. And when those challenges are mitigated, when they dissolve, we need our body to then be able to downregulate. So heart rate variability can be that kind of indicator of, are we responding to these changing circumstances? Heart rate variability, as researchers, including colleagues of mine at New York University, when they're measuring it, they're measuring it using different bands and electrodes that they put on individuals. Sort of like an elastic band just at the bottom of their rib cage, at the top of their chest. And it, it's kind of weird to have a stranger, a researcher in a lab coat, put these different bands on you as they're trying to see what's happening to heart rate variability as they change the circumstances. So, that might not be something that most people have access to or would want to try to implement, to put all these bands and electrodes on themselves to get a precise measure of heart rate variability. But I'm guessing some of these wearables do track that. I don't have wearables on, but do some track heart rate variability? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have two wearables that are interesting and specifically focused on it. So I have a Oura ring that I use for my daily just wear, and it tracks heart rate variability. I have no idea how. And then the second thing that I got years ago, before it was all popular, I got really into getting my body performance up, and I got a device called HeartMath, which is an infrared sensor that you attach to your earlobe, and then it teaches you to control your heart rate variability, so to get it in a more rhythmic flow, because if it's not very rhythmic, then you're experiencing more stress or something like that. Does that make sense? And how accurate are those things?
I don't know how accurate those particular devices are, but I am confident in saying that they bear some meaningful relationship or correlation to what is actually the case. There's at-home blood pressure monitors, and they are not telling people something that's drastically untrue. And the same thing here is that these wearables that you have are probably, pretty good proxy for a more sophisticated but invasive measure that wouldn't be practical or feasible to give you anything that's, useful information in the moment. So you're not going to have a doctor or scientist come with you to a pitch meeting and put all these electrodes and rubber bands all over you to indicate whether your heart is responding to the changing circumstances in a reasonable way. But you can wear your ring, and you can wear a little sensor on your earlobe if you're interested in that, and it'll give you probably a pretty good sense of what's happening. Now, I wouldn't use it diagnostically necessarily, like because it hit this number, it now means that I should diagnose myself as having heart arrhythmia. I wouldn't use it for that kind of purpose. But if you're interested in gaining some insight into how your body is responding to different circumstances, and to use it in a sort of biofeedback kind of way, to give you an awareness or a knowledge that you may not have had before, which then you can do something with that information of like, oh, that's what stress feels like for me. Oh, that's why, it felt like my palms were sweaty and my heart was doing that. I didn't even realize that this was causing me anxiety to have these conversations or to prepare for this kind of an event. So I think that they're great in that they can provide information that you may not otherwise be aware of or have access to. But I would just caution about using it for some sort of conclusion or as diagnostic criteria for something that might be of best diagnosed by a medical professional.
So take it with a grain of salt. Also listen to your body when you're looking at the results. Makes sense. So we dived really deep into part one. So we now know, setting the goals, the vision boards, and everything. We've covered very briefly the next step, which is, the more realistic goals. Can you elaborate more on that? What does the research say there? Do you have some stories to share there of what not to do and what yes to do?
Sure, yeah. So, at that point that we're setting those goals, what's our vision for the future? And we're planning concretely of what does it look like to make progress within this month. We also need to be thinking about those actions that we can specifically take that align with that short-term goal, which aligns with the long-term objectives. And again, that is not surprising to people, I am certain. But we just want to make sure that we equip ourselves and empower our team with those steps that they should be taking that put us on the right direction to accomplishing those short-term and long-term objectives. There's a really cool case study in that it was conducted with a large Dutch telecom company, but it was a serious and large-scale scientific investigation within this one company to look at the impact of coupling this sort of big picture and concrete action planning steps. They decided, this telecom company said, what, our big objective.
Which company was this?
The name is not disclosed. The researchers don't disclose the name. They just give the domain, the space that this company was in. So their objective was related to sustainability and increasing recycling as the manifestation of what a sustainability long-term objective would look like. They wanted their employees to recycle paper and plastic more. So, they brought in a team of researchers to help design a plan that was going to be effective and to assess the impact of the different approaches that they took. They brought in communications specialists to communicate with this all the employees of this large company. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? Why do we care about sustainability? And what are we going to do concretely to focus on to help us with our sustainability initiatives? So, they rolled this out, had an effective communications plan to share what are we doing, how are we going to do this with all the employees. Now, they said what we really want you to do is to focus on, at your own desk when you go get a cup of coffee or you use paper to recycle it, put it in the recycling bins. They looked at how many and how they tracked it was by having researchers replace the janitorial staff at the end of the night. And they literally counted how many things appeared in the trash cans at every person's individual desk that could have and should have otherwise been recycled. So it was an objective measure of people's behavior change with this goal in mind. And what they found was that, each week employees were throwing away about 1,200 items that could have otherwise been recycled. And that was sort of like baseline measure. When they use this really effective communications team to say sustainability goals, we're focusing on recycling, here's what we want you to do. And in fact, here's recycling cans next to your desks. What did they find? Basically no change. There was no change. Just articulating what is our goal, what do we want people to be doing, was not effective at increasing recycling efforts. It didn't change the number of things that showed up in the trash can. And they suspected that would be the case. Based on this research that you and I have been talking about now, they suspected just articulating what our goal is probably not going to do enough to change people's sort of habits, their habit of throwing away their coffee cup rather than recycling their coffee cup, even when we've given them the recycling can to do it. So they suspected that would be the case, and in fact, it was the case. But they compared that experience to one where they added in this concrete action planning. They asked each member of the team, each employee, to think about a concrete action that they could take that would align with the short-term and long-term objectives. and to commit to it. So they took a piece of scrap paper that hopefully they recycled, and they wrote down what could they do. It's not rocket science. People were coming up with things like, if I have a paper cup and I'm done with it, I'll throw it in the recycling. If I use up this paper, I'll put it in recycling. That's exactly what the company wanted their employees to do. But it was the individual employees that came up with that concrete action that aligned with the short-term and long-term objectives. They spent the time. They were empowered to help create the concrete action plans, and they did that. They did it. They created the concrete action plans. Now, what the researchers found out is that, compared to the 1,200 items that were being thrown away at baseline, having employees go through that concrete action planning, even though they weren't generating anything different than what would have been expected of them, reduced the number of recyclables in the trash from about 1,200 to about 200 per week. It was an incredible change. And importantly, it wasn't just like, in the days that followed having employees make that concrete action plan. They looked at a couple weeks later, a couple months later, 2 months later, and even after the point where they took away the individual recycling cans and had recycling only available in communal space. Those numbers still stayed super low. The number of items that were thrown away that should have been recycled still stayed at that extremely low number of hovering around 200 rather than 1,200. Even when they made the action of recycling more challenging for people to do, they were still able to change that habit, the bad habit they had before, to align with the short-term and long-term objectives. So it might seem, it certainly seems like obvious advice. Have a long-term plan, but think concretely about how what you can do today will align with your 1-month goal. But I find this evidence really compelling that, it doesn't take a magician. It doesn't to have dramatic outcomes. It's about engaging individual members to participate in the planning stage, and that can increase commitment and lead to these long-term behavioral outcome differences that we're hoping for.
That makes sense. So just be more involved in the planning phase, especially if you're setting long-term goals for a team. Have everybody involved, even if it's obvious things, because otherwise there's no, investment or something like that.
Yeah, and the other thing that it's doing is it's a behavioral strategy for changing a habit, right? When it comes to what am I going to do with a scrap of paper? I write down a note when I'm on a phone call with somebody, and then then I put that into a memo that I send out. What do I do with that junk now? We've had a professional lifetime of experience of just tossing it into whatever bin is most available to us. And so it's a habit, it's a behavior that we're not putting a lot of cognitive thought into. I'm not saying that we should, but that's the reason why we have a habit, and that's the reason that it's hard to break. We have a lot of experience doing this very same action that we don't ever really spend that much time thinking about. So what is effective about communicating the long-term vision and then involving individuals in the concrete action planning is that it puts more thought into a thoughtless process, and that can help to break what we might call the bad habit, in this case of throwing recyclables away. It puts more cognition into a thoughtless process, and that's how you can break those kinds of habits. And then it sets up the alternative. It's not just like, hey, take a moment to think here. You keep doing this thing, this routine that you have is not so great, but it sets up the alternative. If I have a cup of coffee, then I'll do this instead. I'll throw it into the recycling. And so it puts a bit more cognition into a thoughtless process, but then automates a different behavioral response. So, I'm not saying now we need to all be thinking about recycling all the time and not be thinking about our actual job. No, we just need a moment to break that automatic cycle that's contributing to a bad habit, and then to set up an alternative that also will be just as quick and effortless as the bad habit that we are working to overcome.
So we've covered now the very big picture thing. We've covered the setting the goal part. It seems pretty obvious, especially if you make quite realistic goals for yourself. One of the things that is very popular and that tends to go wrong, and this is maybe me asking you because you're a behavioral psychologist, why does it stop? How come you can get motivated for a week, 2 weeks, maybe even 3 weeks, but then somehow it just doesn't last, and the gyms are empty.
Mm-hmm. Many reasons, a couple that I can think of off the top of my head. One, again, it comes back to what are we doing when we're setting the goals? Set a high level vision, think concretely about what a low level version of that goal would be. What's my 1 month goal? Thinking concretely about those actions. But then there's another thing that we need to do. It's the third step of the process that people often is the most overlooked aspect of goal setting that people don't allocate time to. And that's obstacle planning, foreshadowing failures. At the time that you are thinking and brainstorming, what's my high level goal? You're also thinking about what's my 1 month goal? What can I do to get there? What are the concrete actions I can take? But what are the ways that this is going to go wrong? What is going to happen? What is likely to happen? What could I envision that's going to happen? And what am I going to do about it if I should accomplish this obstacle? And that needs to happen at the very early stages of goal setting. Now, for some people, that might seem really intuitive. For other people, it doesn't. And for those people, the reason why it doesn't seem intuitive is because it's like, I was just in this really good state. I'm really excited about this thing I'm going to take on. I've got everybody really jazzed about what we're working towards and what our 5-year plan is. Why would I then, in that same meeting, want to bring them down and say, like, you know what? This thing we're all really excited about, here are 6 ways that it's going to fail. How is that going to be motivating? And it is. And the reason why is that it sets up the plan B or the plan C. It's the life preserver. It's the same reason why if you are lucky enough to get to go out on a boat and a captain is obligated to tell you, here are where the life jackets are. Why do they do that? Like, hey, I'm going to have this like beautiful sunset cruise around Manhattan. Why do they have to tell me this is what you're going to do when our boat springs a leak or when I crash it into the pier or something? Why would you ruin this beautiful space that we're in right now by telling me how we're really in danger here? Because when that boat is sinking, that's not the time to then be scouring all over the boat to try to find out where those life preservers are. You need to know where it is so you can go to it automatically, because there's other things that you're going to be having to deal with, right? When we're outside of the boat context, when we're in a crisis situation or when we've experienced an obstacle, that there's something that's really challenging right now, that's when we're thin on resources. We don't have as much time. We don't have the money to deal with this right now, or if we don't have the plan already, we're less likely to be able to figure out a solution to the obstacle than if we already know what that solution might be. If we already have our plan B or plan C available, great. Now we don't have to spend our cognitive resources or our brainstorming potential to try to figure out how are we going to work through this. I already gave myself and my team a menu of options about what we can do. So we increase the odds that we can work our way through those obstacles if we have foreshadowed them in advance. And that's often the reason why people throw in the towel on a goal earlier than they want, is that they face an obstacle that's unexpected and they don't know what they're going to do about it. Right? And now it's an even bigger deal. Now there is a problem, but during the middle of this problem, I don't have the time or the mental capacity or the resources to figure out a solution to it, and they quit. Right? That is probably one of the biggest reasons that people leave a goal early, is that they face an obstacle that they're not prepared for. And that then, as a result of facing that obstacle, they don't have the resources to try to work through it. There's a great example of how taking the time to think big picture, plan concretely, and foreshadow obstacles can be really effective. And it's from Michael Phelps, an incredible Olympic swimmer, one of the world's best in Olympic history. He routinely incorporates that foreshadowing of failure into his practice. Now, you might think, like, how would he even know what failure looks like? He's never lost a race in his life, or it seems that way to those of us on the outside. But that is part of his practice, and it's part of the reason that he hardly has ever lost a race in his life. There's this really big moment back in 2008, first time he was on the Olympic stage and the world was paying attention. The Olympics were in Beijing, and he was then on the brink of doing something that no Olympic athlete has ever done in the history of the Olympic Games, which is win 8 gold medals in a single Olympic Games. At the point of this story, he had already won 7. He had just the 200 fly in front of him, and if he won that, he'd win his 8th gold medal and break this all-time world record for most number of gold medals won. the fly is his thing, right? That's what he was known for. This is his competition. As he dove into the pool, his goggles started to leak. As he did the laps back and forth, by the time he had just one length of the pool left to go, they were completely filled with water, and he was essentially swimming blind. Now, if that happened to me, which it never would, because I could hardly keep myself afloat in the pool, and I certainly wouldn't find myself in the Olympic Games next to Michael Phelps, but I would have completely panicked, right? That would be the end of like, I can't see anything. How am I supposed to get there? But for him, he didn't freak out at all. This wasn't a big deal to him because he had routinely practiced, what will I do if this happens, if my goggles start to fail? In fact, sometimes as in practice, like right before he dove into the pool, his coach would rip the goggles off his head and smash him with his foot so that there was no way that he could even be practicing wearing any goggles. So rather than freak out and feel like, okay, this is it, I guess I'm not going to win this race, he calmly switched his attention to his stroke count because he had envisioned what happens when my goggles don't work and what will I do about it? And that was start counting my strokes. So he knew exactly how many strokes it takes for him to get from one end of the pool to the other. And so he did that. He started counting his strokes. He won that 200 fly. He won that race. He won, as a result, his 8th gold medal, and then he'd go on to win 15 more in his career. But I think that's an incredible story of what might seem like an insurmountable, like awful circumstance to experience that you would hope your whole life you would never have to go through. But for him, because he spent the time thinking about that possibility and planning for it, it didn't cause him stress. He, didn't miss a beat and just calmly turned to the plan B, and it was incredibly successful. So why is that effective? It's effective because a lot of people don't do it. It offers the plan B so that when you're in a crisis moment or what might be a crisis moment, you've already got a menu of options laid out for you for what you should do. And by having that in place, we increase the odds that experiencing an obstacle won't mean that the entire pursuit, the entire goal is now doomed to fail.
I had a really good question that I blanked on right now.
I can add just one more thing, which is, like, why else do people fail at goals? And it comes down to, obstacles, about how do we work through obstacles. Another thing that is an obstacle is that, again, it comes back to this like automaticity of our behavior. What triggers our behavior when we're not really thinking about what it is that we're doing? And sometimes when we change our circumstances, when we put ourselves in a new context, we don't have those same sort of automatic triggers of the good, healthy habits, the productive habits that we've created before. And we don't recognize that. We don't recognize that, like, when I lived in this neighborhood, I had a really nice park. And so when I would go out, I'd see this nice park. And that would excite me or inspire me to exercise. So when I moved to this new neighborhood and I don't have that park anymore, I don't have that same sort of like trigger, that trigger that made me like, oh, I'm excited to go for a run. And researchers have found that like that is a major contributor to people changing what was a really great habit, and that people don't realize that. So if we recognize that our visual surroundings actually trigger a lot of the things that lead to our success, especially those things that might seem sort of like everyday everyday behaviors that aren't of much consequence. Well, that's a lot of what we need to get the job done, right? Is like every day putting in a little bit, every day making the right choice. And when that accumulates, we can meet a really large and long-term goal. But when those triggers in our environment change, we might need to be aware of that. Like, what was reminding me to do this thing that I need to do every day is no longer there. So if we find ourselves like we've moved to a new office, or we've changed departments, or we're starting up a new workspace or something, we need to be really cognizant of what was it that was creating a positive outcome before that we may not have been thinking about, that we most likely weren't thinking about, and try to recreate that visual trigger in the new space if we want to continue habits. Because when those triggers change, really great habits can get broken instantly.
So recreating visual triggers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so my question was, you were covering plan B, plan C, so all these failures. Are you only doing this for the main goals, or is this also for these small little goals in between?
I think it's more useful to think about it in terms of the small little goals in between, the 1 month goals that we have, because those are concrete and measurable objectives. So it might be easier to identify what will be the obstacle that gets in my way of bringing in $50,000 by the end of the month. Like, what is going to stand in my way? It can be easier to identify what that obstacle is. Oh, because I have this like major family obligation in the middle of the month, and that's going to take me away from being able to call potential investors. That's the obstacle. So what's going to be the workaround? Well, then that means that I need to allocate twice as much time this week because I'm going to have zero time this next week. So, but if we leave it at just the like, I want to bring in $10 million in 5 years, 2 years, whatever. What's going to stand in my way? I don't know. That seems like much more challenging to think through what's going to stand in the way of $10 million in 2 years than what will stand in the way of my 1 month goal of $50,000 this month. So I think, the process won't seem as overwhelming, and it'll be something that's more sustainable, to a habit that we can develop and continue to implement over time when we just try to stay focused on what are those smaller objectives. We can think more concretely about what needs to happen to meet that goal and what is likely to be an obstacle if we focus at that lower level.
I'll probably be re-listening to this podcast, so one of the questions that I'll have is a bit more concrete. If I have my whiteboard in front of me, what are the time spans for the goals that I'm setting? Am I doing a goal every day, every week, every month? You mentioned 5 years. What is long term? Is that 10 years, 20 years? Like, which time spans am I writing on the whiteboard?
I think, for me, I think working in the level of the week, but setting daily goals is important. So this was actually, I asked this question myself. I wondered this of myself and members of my research team of like, what sort of unit of time should we be thinking in that's going to be most effective? So we went through this experience and we took a week and we thought about what is it that we're really excited about? What's a project that we're working on right now that is not going to get done today, this week, probably won't even get done this month, but requires our daily investment that we should be investing in daily or at minimum a couple times a week. So everybody's goals were different. Somebody was a film producer and she really needed to get to this point in terms of production by the end of the month. Somebody else was trying to get into medical school. They were going to be taking the MCATs, right? The goals are all over the place. But the techniques that we used and we tested were the same. So for 1 week, what we did was, on Sunday, here's the goal. This is what I want to accomplish. On Monday morning, we woke up and said, what can we do? What do we need to do today? What progress can be made today? And slotted it into our calendar. We said, all right, here's my time. This is the time today that I can do this thing that I identified as being important for the goal today. At the end of the day, people reported on how much time they spent. Did you do this thing? Were you able to meet this appointment that you set with yourself? How much time did you spend working on this? Tuesday morning, same thing. What can I do today? When can I do it? At the end of the day, they reported, did you do it? How much time did you spend working on this thing for your goal? Then we counted up how many hours did people spend in the week on tasks that were associated with this long-term goal that they had. That was thinking in terms of the day. It was setting daily goals. We contrasted that with thinking in terms of the week. So Sunday morning, people woke up. What's the goal that we're working on? And then they spent more time on Sunday and thought about, all right, what are 10 things? What are the things that I need to get done that can get done this week that's going to help me make progress? And on Sunday, they made appointments with themselves for the next 6 days that followed. They slotted in time into their calendar to work on these different aspects of the task that they had already identified as being important. Like before, at the end of every day, they reported how many hours did you spend working on this task. And what we found when we compared is that within a week, people found 2.5 more hours of time to work on their goal when they thought in terms of the week compared to thought in terms of the day. And that this was a strategy that was effective for 66% of the people. So 2 out of every 3 people found more time and were able to dedicate and actually spend more time working on their tasks when they planned in terms of the week. Why is that? Because we prioritize what's in our calendar over the things that we just try to keep in mind. So when we start thinking like, okay, I know I need to get to this, and I'll do it when I have some extra time. If a meeting ends early or, I'll just stay up later to get this done. We don't find that extra time. But when we have pre-committed to it, when we have dedicated time into our calendar, the other things that come up, the next day or that are unexpected appointments or requirements, those get worked around our pre-commitment that we made to the time that we decided we would allocate to this project.
So weekly is more important. At one point you mentioned it's 66%, 2/3 benefit from it. How many people was this based on?
Yeah, we did it. It was about 25 people that we did this study with. So, not something that's going to appear in print, in one of our rigorous experimental social psychology journals, but, not an inconsequential number of people. And importantly, they came from all different kinds of backgrounds. Their experience with their goal was all really different. What that goal was highly varied. So we would call this a strong pilot study, a strong test of the idea that we feel, gives us pretty good insight into what would be true if we scaled this up to a larger sample.
Have you ever considered going more than just 25 people? Because it seems quite small.
Oh, sure. Yeah. There's so many research questions that we want to test, and it's just how much time do we have to invest in testing any of these questions right now. So it's definitely on the to-do list of things that we want to be able to test more of. But there's all kinds of questions about goal setting that we're currently working on studying right now.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, then had a really important question as we're kind of nearing the end already. It is something that I found doesn't get brought up a lot and almost takes a behavioral psychologist to maybe look into. And we discussed it briefly on the call before the podcast, of course. So throughout the event's life that we set up, we've had a lot of startups come and go, and many of them, succeeding. One of the things that I notice and actually have experienced myself as well is that you hit a certain goal that was so outside of your scope. It was so unrealistic. It was so unrealistic you didn't even think about it. And then suddenly you hit it. And then I feel like, I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like there's nothing else after that. The question that seems to pop up is always, what's next? And it's very hard to answer it. My question to you then is, have you seen that in your research pop up? How does it manifest itself? Why does it manifest itself? And how do people resolve it as well, or answer the question for themselves?
Yeah, I think it's certainly something that you're saying comes up a lot in entrepreneurship, but, it comes up in all different facets of life too. Think about, for a lot of people, planning a wedding is a big deal. It's something that you're working on for a number of months, lots of coordinating people and parts and stuff. And then you have this big event, and then 2 days later, when everybody's gone home and you're just left with the mess, or somebody's done cleaning up the mess, then you're like, what now? What do I do with all my time, right? The first year of marriage is actually really rocky for a lot of reasons, but one of them is now it's time to reset the goal. The goal no longer is to get married, to be married. You just got married. And now it's about recalibrating. What's the next thing? And that's something, that's often an overlooked part of marriage that contributes to a lot of the problems that people have early on in their marriage, is that, getting someone to sign the piece of paper or exchanging rings is a big step, getting to that place. But then you have to reset the next goal. And so I think, just first of all, acknowledging that this is a common experience is important, because you might start to second guess yourself and your ability and want to shift your self-concept. You might start thinking I don't know what I want now. Okay, I hit this milestone, but there's no second step. Am I a one-hit wonder? Is that what this is? And maybe I don't have what it takes to actually do this for 20 or 30 years. Maybe I got lucky. That can be people's inclination, is to start trying to appraise or think about, why did this happen and what does it mean that I don't have the next idea, and to extrematize it, to take it to conclusions or implications that just aren't valid, because it is totally normal to have hit a major milestone and then to come down, to to let that cortisol release, to let that blood pressure come down, and to relax, because you probably have been working at a pretty intense pace in order to accomplish this thing that even you surprised yourself at being able to accomplish. Your body needs some downtime. And that might mean also just like your brain turning off, and you might not have that next step already at the ready. And that's okay. And it doesn't mean that you don't belong in this space. And it doesn't mean that you are an anomaly or that you're a failure or that you should start changing how you think about yourself and your prospects for the future. It's a totally natural part of the evolution of setting and meeting our goals, is to have that sort of ebb and flow of excitement or investment or generative thoughts. So that's step one, is to acknowledge that that is the case, that I will likely experience that. So after acknowledging that, like, this ebb and flow, this, feeling like I'm full of ideas and feeling like I'm not, after acknowledging that that's the case, then what else can we do about it so that we can move through and not to be stuck at that trough, right, of having no ideas? So, something that we do as just a part of my research team is that we just keep a journal. We keep a journal of ideas, or a log somewhere, so that when we have these moments of like intense creativity where it's not possible to take on the challenges or to take on all the different research ideas that we want, that we at least note them, so that when we're feeling a lull or like I have more time now, or the resources are there, or this project has wrapped up, what do I want to do next? You don't have to try to reconstruct all of those really generative and creative brainstorming sessions you've had. You can go back to your notes to find it. And that's been really useful because we all go through that. A project wraps up, and then we're looking for the next thing. And it's great to give yourself a break. And in fact, you probably should. But then at some point we want to start back up again, and we've already invested that time into brainstorming what those great ideas are. And so long as you write them down, you've got a resource then that you can go to find those ideas. But also give yourself, like as a third suggestion, give yourself the acceptance to just live in that space where you've had this really great project that's really effective and really successful. Then you come down and you're wondering, what do I do next? Well, that's the place where we can get out of that myopic thinking and be able to have more time and bandwidth without being so narrowly focused on trying to meet an objective, to start thinking more creatively and to think outside of the box, because there's no longer a box that we're working within. So savor that freedom that comes with having accomplished a pretty major goal, and the mental bandwidth that you've now acquired again, to use that as an opportunity for thinking, for having conversations with people you don't normally have time to have conversations with, to give your team members time to contribute, and to offer suggestions and feedback in maybe ways that they don't normally have the time or the freedom to do, or that you don't normally have the time and freedom to listen to. So try to break the routine in those moments, to try to get new perspectives and new ideas into the mix. Like literally do different things during that time to meet new people, see new possibilities, see what else is happening in this space that other people are doing, to get those creative juices flowing again.
I feel like, so that answer is definitely appropriate if you achieved a big goal. Do you feel the same answer applies if you've achieved a big goal, but then you're there and you somehow didn't think it was going to be that result, and that the result is way less than what you had in your mind when you set out? Does that make sense? Does your answer apply to that as well?
Yeah, it does, right? So it could be just that our expectations were just set at levels that were not appropriate. Right? So does it mean that I have failed at what I have accomplished, or does it mean that I failed at the goal setting stage? It could be that. It could be that your expectations or your requirements for what's going to be considered successful were completely unreasonable out of the bat, and life showed you that that's not something that can be accomplished. Again, turning back to that personal or professional board of directors, they might be helpful in helping you to come up with that conclusion. Were your goals wrong, or was the progress the problem? And that might be important, as you will inevitably find yourself at the stage of setting goals again in the future. Is that where you need to make some changes? Or is it that you need to make changes in how you try to pursue these goals? Because the goals were appropriate, it's just how you worked on them didn't lead to the kinds of conclusions that you wanted in the end. also just keep in mind, something that is true about science and that my mentor taught me, 20 years ago, very early on in our career, our careers together, was that some of the greatest accomplishments that he has had in his career, his biggest, most significant scientific findings were ones that he was completely wrong about in advance. He thought it was going to turn out this way. He designed, courses of research that he expected were going to produce these results. And the most meaningful, important, and impactful things that he's ever found in his career were what came because he was completely wrong. He set a goal. It looks like it was a failure because it went an entirely different way than what he thought, but that ended up having the biggest impact on his scientific career and changing the course of science for others as we knew it. So, that I think is a moment where we start to realize like humility is important and that you set a goal. And if it turns out the way that you wanted, well, that's great in some sense. But if it didn't, you're not God. You don't necessarily know the way that your life and everyone's life and the world is going to react to what you put into it to allow you to pursue that narrow course of action that you set out to in advance. And that's humility, right? Is recognizing that it might not turn out the way that we want, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use the word failure or be disappointed, right? It's about it's all about learning and taking what was given to us or what was produced and finding what is of value in that, and having the humility to recognize that we may not have laid out the perfect plan or course of action or expectations for this situation in advance.
We're kind of nearing the end. Maybe the last question is, what is a question that nobody has asked you, but you wish, somebody had asked you about specifically your book and your research?
A question nobody has asked me.
Because the research that you do is quite important and very applicable to all of us. And you're going to get, I can imagine, all of these questions that I've been asking you also from family and friends. But what is something that, I guess the question is kind of like with entrepreneurship or any skill level, we don't know what we don't know. You're researching this. So what is it that we don't know that we should be asking you?
We spend, it's like, I get asked a lot about what should I do in this circumstance. People, have a problem that they've identified and then they want the solution to it. And that's the way that our research tends to operate too. We identify a problem and then we find a solution to it. But you just said something that's really interesting that has sparked my answer here. You use the phrase the unknown unknowns. And I think that's a really interesting space for everybody to play in, for me as a researcher and for people who are consuming the knowledge that we produce to help shape the way that they set goals, is to think about those unknown unknowns. Rather than reflecting on the past and thinking about what were the problems or successes that I experienced, what should I take from that, is playing devil's advocate and living in a hypothetical world a little bit more. And what are the things that nobody has ever experienced before? What are the problems that don't get talked about? Maybe because they're embarrassing and nobody wants to share those, or they were scary and we don't want to go back and relive that space. So pushing ourselves to think about those unknowns, like what are the solutions to the things that I never want to be thinking about, I think is it can be really lucrative. There's a cool app that I came across that I think can help in that regard, like unknown unknowns. How am I supposed to be thinking about the things that I never thought about before? That might be how your listeners are taking this. Like, that's a ridiculous thing to be putting on the table. But there's this cool app called 1 Second Every Day.
Yeah, I know it.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most popular, most downloaded apps, and it is an incredible story of entrepreneurial success as well. And really, Cesar Kurikama was the guy who started this, and the idea is that you snap a 1 second video every day, and the app compiles that, and you can string together this montage of 1 second of your life for however long a period of time that you want to do it. And people have been using this app since it was in beta version, like 9 years ago. And so 1 second every day for 9 years can give you a really great retrospective on where you've been, where you're coming, and where you're going. Now, when I asked him, like, what's your most special 1 second video that you've ever shot and all the time that you've been using this app that you've developed yourself? And he said it's of a wall. It's of a brick wall. It could be a photograph, right? Because it's a brick wall. It's not doing anything. Do you really need video to document a brick wall? And of course, everyone he tells that to, including me, is like confused. Like, why is a brick wall the most significant 1 second video of your life when you've had a pretty amazing ride with this app that you've developed? And he says it because it reminds him of the thing that he would otherwise and that most people would never want to remember. It was what he saw when he left the room, having left his sister-in-law's hospital room when she was admitted to the ER with an emergency situation, that her intestines were starting to strangulate themselves and she was moments away from dying. And that's the first thing he saw when he learned that his sister-in-law might die. And he snapped a video of that first thing that he saw. Now, they had an emergency surgery. She lived through it. It was fine. But it's in that moment when he just realized, you know what? Life and family is the most precious and important thing to me. And I recognize now that my pursuit of this personal project, this 1 second everyday app, is coming at the cost of the thing that actually matters more, which is spending time with my friends and family. And so that's why that wall is so important to him, because it reminds him of the moment when he made that transition from putting aside some of his professional goals to reminding him of the importance of his personal ones, and that those, in fact, trump his professional goals. So, and I like that story that he has to tell, because that is something that our brain, that experience is one that our brain has evolved a psychological immune system to protect ourselves against. Serious trauma within a family, a near-death experience that, was horrible for their family to work through. Our brain has evolved to help us to put those aside, to move forward, to focus on the positive, because living in that state of stress and depression and misery and anxiety isn't sustainable. And our brain can help support our transition out of that space. But for him, those negative feelings that our brain has worked so hard to help us forget is what he needs to remind him of what's most important. So 1 second every day, a really cool app, and just one tool of many that can help push us into staying within that unknown space, to be thinking about the things that we don't want to think about, that we haven't thought about, that our brain might work really hard to help us to forget. Staying in that space might be actually what we need to do to help us prioritize our goals, like he has, or to think about possibilities that don't come naturally to us. And that's something that doesn't get talked a lot about, that doesn't get asked a lot about. What should we be thinking about? Well, we can be thinking about the things that we don't want to be thinking about rather than the things that we do.
That's a great answer. I would say that's a great way also to end the podcast. Before we do, I want to roll out the red carpet. Is there anything you want to share? Where can people find you? Anything to promote? Obviously the book, where can people find that?
Yeah, sure. Last thing that I want to share is just, like I said before, there is no prescription for doing this life right, for meeting your goals in the most effective way. It's about flexibility. What I hope to share, and what the philosophy that the book takes, is expanding our toolkit. You never really know what the future is going to hold, but what we can do is develop all the tools that are available to us to manage those unknowns that might come our way in the future. So my research, my perspective is, let's offer you 2, 3, 5, 6 new possibilities of things that you might try out should your go-to tactic not be working anymore. And I think that's a healthy philosophy, is not to try to get the formula right, but instead to expand our toolkit of possibilities. You can check me out on LinkedIn. Everything that I write for different forums or different media that I produce, I'll connect through LinkedIn, so you can read more about these ideas there on the LinkedIn profile, or also in the book, Clearer, Closer, Better: How Successful People See the World.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being on, and hope to see you maybe on a future podcast as well.
Thanks. Sounds great. I really enjoyed this conversation.
If you liked this episode, you can check out our most recent one here. And if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access and support to any business question from the entire startup funding event team.